Have you ever found yourself in a place that seems so isolated, so totally empty that it feels frozen in time? It's a strange feeling in familiar places. An empty street late at night, an office building after hours, an indoor mall in 2026. Liminal spaces have exploded in popularity in the last few years, with the original Backrooms image and the incredible Kane Pixel series that followed. And I've just finished reading a collection that brings liminal horror to the coast. Salt in the Trees by Kelly Skaggs is a new collection of short indie horror stories. And there's a lot to love in this quick read, so let's look inside. The book begins with a story called Alice's Swim. Like I said, liminal horror is big right now. Audiences have really taken to stories featuring strange, in-between spaces, and the internet is flooded with images depicting places that seem stuck in time. Not simply empty, but totally forgotten. Yet somehow the light stays on. It's a genre built on vibes, and there's often a sense of nostalgia built in, with images set in times long past. The spaces may glow with 80s neon, or depict slides and playgrounds, objects from an increasingly distant childhood and clouded with fading memory. And it's through that foggy memory that we look back on a strange occurrence from Alice's childhood. So our teenage protagonist has a lot going on in her life. A loving if slightly dysfunctional family, the pressure of pass or fail tests coming up in school, that sort of thing. The only place where she can really clear her head is underwater, so she takes evening walks to her neighborhood pool. And after each swim, Alice has to walk back home through a neighborhood that seems totally empty. It's just her, the hum of the streetlights, and the swaying palm trees. But on her walk home one night, she thinks she can hear footsteps just out of pace with her own. And not right behind her, but in the marshy palms. And then she hears whispers, panicked voices in the branches. If there's anything worse than wandering the streets alone, it's suddenly realizing that you're not alone. Growing nervous, Alice quips to herself. And quips are quips. Some of them might come across like cheesy Marvel movie lines. When something goes wrong, you might hear, "Absolutely love that for me." And you might find some of these lines a bit trite, but remember, Alice is 15 years old. She's nervous and she's trying to calm herself down. And I would not say those lines are representative of Skaggs' overall writing. But regardless of what Alice has to say, the creepy sounds following her stop as soon as she reaches the end of the palmettos. And this creepy experience only gets worse anytime she walks the streets alone after dark. Alice does some investigative work into what could be causing the haunting presence in the palms, and without giving too much away, the story has an interesting take on the earthed memories trope. But I think there's room to wonder if all this could be in Alice's head. After all, she has a worried mind. Remember, she goes swimming in the first place to calm down her anxious thoughts, and the story makes good on Skaggs' offer of coastal horror. The scenario as it develops is unique to the region and its history, and there are little details that would warm the humid heart of anyone who's ever lived on the Gulf Coast. I really appreciate the town's attempt to decorate for Halloween despite the hot Florida weather, where the entire neighborhood smelled like pumpkins rotting in real time. One of the most popular environments for liminal storytelling is the empty mall, and this book's second story takes us deep inside the forgotten corridors of a Florida mall after hours. We follow a young man named Jacob as his smoke break ends and he has to return to his job as the mall's custodian. But before he even steps back inside the mall, we get a glimpse into his character. He passes a lone car in the parking lot, a nice one, and he's tempted, sorely tempted, to just check the handle to see if it's unlocked. But that curiosity has cost him dearly before. Jacob has done time in prison for the exact same mistake, and this janitor job is his attempt to get his act together and be the man he knows he should be. And so he passes on the temptation, steps inside, and gets to work. Skaggs does a good job of setting the scene with sensory descriptors. You need that for that liminal horror effect, and she's got it down. As Jacob pushes his cart along, we're struck with the aromas and odors that accompany a public space. All the gross little stains and accidents, and the cleaning materials used to cover them up. And the service halls used by the staff are so ugly with their offensive lighting and fluorescent hum. Again, there's a strong relationship between liminal space and nostalgia, and this story has a lot of callbacks and cues to set the story firmly in the late 1990s. Jacob often checks his Nokia phone with its green backlit screen, and he has flashbacks to 2 years earlier when Men in Black was in theaters. That puts the story around 1999. But Skaggs doesn't just use the past as set dressing. Regional history shapes the environment. In these stories, we see recurring imagery of floodlines and high water marks. These are scars left on the land and memory by the unstoppable force of hurricane. Alice still remembers the floodwaters of Hurricane Gordon rising up against her windows, and Jacob sees where Hurricane Andrew wrote his name on the wall with flood lines. Location's memory is at the center of the strange happenings throughout Salt in the Trees. And the strange happenings in this story begin when Jacob discovers a door that was not there before. So he enters and wanders down a maintenance corridor until he reaches an escalator, and he climbs on just to become trapped in a never-ending ascent, where time seems to pass him by even though he feels like he's going nowhere. It's not just liminal, it's existential. You'll notice some repetition in going up, but I think it serves a purpose. Jacob is locked in a cycle, and Skaggs works in Ouroboros imagery to drive that point. Even though he's technically moving, it's hard to see if he's making any progress. We hit the beach for this next story, Fort Carcosa. One thing that I like about all these stories is that we see characters who have something else going on in their lives before the horror gets there. They could be caught up with teenage stress or trying to get their life back on the right track. They already have a relatable conflict going on in their lives. So no matter what else happens, they feel grounded. So for this story, our man Dave has been living on a shoestring budget for his entire adult life. But now he has a teaching job lined up at the end of the summer. He just has to make that $5 in his pocket last until then. But today he can relax, so he's headed down to an island for a day at the beach. Just Dave, a joint, and an 8-track player. In each of these stories, the characters take comfort in listening to scary story recordings. It's always in some form of radio show or a podcast, a loving reference to the YouTube show Creepcast, which Skaggs mentions in her book's dedication. And so Dave falls asleep on the sand. But when he wakes up, the island around him has changed. The sand dunes feel taller, the brush denser, and the sun sets faster than it should. I really enjoy the language in this story. When it's time to relax, Dave lights a joint to soften the edges of reality. And when time seems to move too quickly, it's like someone had skipped a reel in the day's film. So something is wrong, but when Dave tries to leave the island, he can only drive in circles until he runs out of gas. So he returns to the trail that leads back to the beach, but the trail has grown wild, and as he wanders, we find that Dave has stepped back in time. Not back to the 90s, he's gone back to the colonial days when a fort dominated the island. And at this time, the fort is occupied, so we get to meet some proper antagonists in this story. Soldiers pursue Dave through the brush, and we learn that the land is cursed. We jump through time in this story, first seeing the island in modern day where there is no fort. Then we see the fort when it was in use, and then just a few decades ago when the fort was destroyed by a storm. All these different phases of time fit together around Dave, as the book puts it, like puzzle pieces from different boxes that still make a picture. So up until this point in the book, we've heard about storms, we've seen signs of the destruction that they can cause. But in this story, our protagonist is caught right in the middle of one, and we get to see that destruction and that terrible, inescapable power of the flood firsthand. If you're looking on a map, you won't find a place called Fort Carcosa in Florida. There were plenty of Spanish forts around the Gulf Coast, but from what I can gather, this name isn't pulled from history. It's a nod to a fictional city and other works of weird and eldritch horror. The name first appeared in Ambrose Bierce's short story, An Inhabitant of Carcosa. In the story, a man awakes after a long sleep to wander through a strange land. He eventually realizes that he is in Carcosa, where he was from, but the city is now an ancient ruin. Since then, the name has appeared in other works like The King in Yellow and The World of Ice and Fire. So in literature, Carcosa is a strange place, out of time and even cursed, and that fits perfectly with the forgotten fort that Dave stumbles upon. The last of the 4 stories takes place in a hospital called St. Ignatius, and it departs from the retro settings by starting in the present day. We first meet an unnamed narrator who has to clean out the hospital's top floor, which has been shut down since COVID. So while this story focuses less on liminal space, I do think that's an interesting way to incorporate it. The rise in liminal space's popularity coincided with lockdown, when places that were once filled with life were suddenly empty. And in this case, the top floor has been abandoned ever since then. In the previous stories, it's a storm, a hurricane that leaves its mark on the land. But here, the pandemic is the dividing line in time. The old floor is unchanged since the before times, and as our narrator explores, they discover a jump drive hidden behind a stack of papers in an old drawer. And this intro had me hooked. It felt so very relatable to return to a place that had been left just long enough to feel dated, to be shaded under the high water line left behind by COVID, left long enough for something as quotidian as a jump drive to have its own air of mystery. It takes some work to find an old computer that can run the jump drive, but when our narrator opens the files, they find the personal notes from a nurse named Jacoby.
I made up a girl, and I gave her the name Jacoby.
And from that point, the story settles in as an epistolary tale told from the nurse's journal entries. Epistolary fiction, told through letters, emails, journals, and so on, can be great for stoking intrigue, and we get to see the character's emotional state decline as the horrors reveal themselves. And through Jacoby, I think Skaggs achieves her strongest writing in the whole book. We get some of the most vivid descriptions of the languid heat, and Skaggs works in healthcare. When she's writing a nurse character, she has some professional insight into that perspective. That really comes across as Jacoby tries to address unexplainable events with a clinical approach. Jacoby's entries recount her experiences from 2018, when she worked night shifts on the hospital's locked unit on the top floor. And one patient stood out to the nurse, the charismatic Mrs. Hancock. This elderly woman is bedridden and considered the hospital's permanent resident, occupying room 696. But she was once a spiritual force, a tent revival preacher and later a snake handler. And the more time Jacoby spends with Mrs. Hancock, the more the spirit world takes an interest in her. And there we meet the book's most haunting figure, something right out of our shared nightmares. I appreciate it when characters try to find a practical explanation in the face of supernatural challenges, and I think Jacoby's methodical approach makes sense here. The journaling format also lets us see how dread encroaches on a rational mind. Of the 4 stories, this one is a bit of a departure in subject matter, but I think it rounds the book out nicely. Jacoby is not so much exploring a liminal space, but caught in a liminal state of being, the hypnagogic state, between awake and asleep. And there were definitely a couple of moments that creeped me out later while I was thinking about them. At the back of the book, Skaggs includes a preview of her upcoming story, The Storm. It follows a young man named Evan who has to stay with his Aunt Claire while his mother is traveling on business. Evan's father left the family suddenly, so Evan has had to grow up in order to help his mother, who is barely holding it all together. We join the family in the car as they travel deep down rural roads, moss hanging overhead below a gray-green sky. A storm is coming. And then we meet Aunt Claire in her isolated home. There's a tension between Aunt Claire and Evan's mother, and there's a looming sense of danger, even if it's too early to see where that danger is going to come from. We'll just have to wait and see. So I hope you'll check out Salt in the Trees. While visual media lends itself to liminal storytelling, it's nothing new to literature. Think of the factory running without workers in the Red Tower, or the bleak automation without purpose in There Will Come Soft Rains. And now we see it done very well in Salt in the Trees. My copy has some of those first edition flaws, the sort of thing you don't catch until you get the prints back, but that's totally forgivable. And for a first outing, Salt in the Trees is a solid collection of horror fiction. This author takes advantage of liminal fiction's inherent nostalgia, and she evokes the past with purpose. If you dig liminal space, or if you just want eerie stories with a coastal setting, then I recommend this book to you. It's a good beach read, or you could take it out to the pool and sweat along with the characters. And don't forget that Skaggs has another project in the works. I've got plenty in the works too. I recently put out a review of The Horror by David Sodergren, and I realized how much I enjoy book reviews. So I'll be doing more of those in the future. They might not all be new releases, but I do want to hype indie authors whenever I can. So if you love horror, whether that's on the page or on the screen, stay tuned. I'll be back with another video before too long. Bye for now.